If there, again, I'm Tim Grant, I'm your host. We're going to start in a couple of minutes, but while we're waiting to get going, it might be helpful to know if any of you have not been on a Zoom call until now. And if that's the case, I want to encourage you to take your cursor down to the bottom of your screen where you're going to see a row of icons, and I want you to click chat, which will open up the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And you'll see at the very bottom, you can type a message into any individual that's on the call, or at the very top, everyone in the meeting. If you've not used Zoom before, please type a quick message. And to do that again, you simply say, I've never used Zoom before, and then hit enter on your keyboard, and I'll make sure that you're capable of saying hello, asking a question when we get to the Q&A sometime later in the session, assuming we have the time for that. So please do take a moment to let us know if you've never used Zoom before. I suspect at this point, a couple months into the pandemic, there aren't many of us in that circumstance, but we always want to make sure that everybody can fully participate. So do take advantage of the opportunity to let us know if you've not used a Zoom before.
How does this work, Tim? You like talk into your computer and hear you? Or?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's such fun, Phil, to be looking at names of people that some of whom I've worked with for some years, and names of people I've heard of that I've not worked with. It's a big party right across the country, and we tend to know each other, and those who are in neighboring ridings. And for those who don't know me, I'm in downtown Toronto speaking to you, but I already recognize some of you from across the country, and so a warm welcome to all of you wherever you are from. And in fact, we're going to do our land acknowledgement in a couple of moments a little differently. I want to give you a heads up about that because I'd like you, and I really enjoy doing this live in front of people, but that's essentially what I love to do is ask, because we're from all different parts of Canada, and particularly from Ontario here, when we do the land acknowledgement, I'm going to make it kind of open-ended and invite you to put into the chat box who are the original peoples in whichever part of Ontario or Canada that you are from. And that'll also give us a good sense of who's who and where you're calling in from. Oh, that's lovely. I'll take that. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Pauline, for reminding us. We're going to ask everybody to mute themselves. There'll be opportunities to ask if we have if we do have a Q&A session at the end, as I hope we will unmute you to, or sorry, I think questions are going to be sent to me, but that you'll be posting in the chat box. So it will be important to mute yourself once we get going. But again, warm welcome to all of you. I see we've got a good numbers of people here, and if past experience is any guide, of course, most people will be showing up a respectable 5 or 10 minutes late. So we will repeat just the bare minimum instructions. Elizabeth,
hi, Tim. I figured it was best that I not be late. I'm sorry about being on the edge of late.
Not to worry. That's all good. It's all good. Great. And just looking at the, I see we've got, I know everyone can't turn on their camera which would be ideal, but those of you who can, please do. I'm going to just look at the list of, take a quick look at the list of participants. Great. Okay, what a wonderful group. Okay. And I'm just checking to see. if we have Annamie Paul, as I think we do, but I don't see her yet. And as soon as I do, we will start. There she is.
Where's Annamie? Oh, Annamie.
Great. Good, good. All right, is everybody happy and healthy on this Saturday afternoon / evening, depending where you are in the country? Okay, so I'm Tim Grant.
I'm gonna say Tim. I'm gonna go right out front and say I'm not a happy person, but we can move on from there. I just was reading the news coverage from the U.S. and I don't know. I know you guys are in control of what we talk about, and we have a whole lot of agenda things to talk about. But since part of today was to talk about cities, I'm also hoping that today we might be able to have a conversation about race. Really very, very worried about what I see happening south of the border and in Canada. So I just want to put that out there. It's just, I was just reading before we started this meeting, what appears to be clear that the violence being done, at least in Minneapolis, is a combination of, the governor of Minnesota has said it's white supremacists working with drug cartels. Wow. So I just wanted, that was on my mind as we start, and it's also really on my mind as we start to acknowledge the deep loss that Annamie has experienced in her father's passing. And I just wanted to say before we start anything, my deepest, deepest sympathies to my dear friend Annamie. I know you're going ahead with this, and we talked about what. So Tim, I turn it over to you, but that's my context is I'm a jumble of emotions. I'm not a happy camper at the moment. I'm grieving for Annamie, and I'm distressed by the state of the world. But I will now shut up, and we're in your hands.
Rightly so. It is quite horrific what happened in Minnesota, but all right, we will proceed. We have a tight agenda, so I will, without further ado, get started. But again, a warm welcome to all of you for joining us for this evening's wonderful, what we're calling the New Normal Tour. And as I alluded to, some of you who joined us early, we're going to do a little different kind of land acknowledgement. We always do one at the beginning of these sessions, but in this case, what we're going to do is, let me say that, of course, we all begin by acknowledging the land that on which was inhabited by indigenous peoples for millennia before Europeans came and began the colonization process. But I would invite you to put into the chat box the names of the First Nations in the part of Canada that you are from, so that and I think that will be a nice, apart from a richer land acknowledgement, it's also a wonderful way to indicate where all of us this evening are from and get a sense of our collective selves. I also want to, I'm just in a moment going to introduce the Green Party of Canada leadership contestant Annamie Paul, who will in turn set the stage for this evening's conversation with Elizabeth May. But later on, there's going to be a fundraiser at the end. And if you, by the way, are interested in donating but don't want to do so publicly, I want you to send a message in the chat to Rachel Mellums, who will be joining us shortly, and or you can send it to me again as a private message, and we'll make sure that that's taken care of. Okay, without further ado, it is my great pleasure, and Annamie Paul, we're so delighted that in spite of the real difficult situation you've been confronted with in the last 48 hours that you're with us this evening, I will only say it there's many things I could say about you in introduction, but you have an incredible international history, work with an international NGO scene, but I've came to know you as a candidate in the neighboring riding here in downtown Toronto, and right from the go-get, I realized I had an exceptional running mate in the riding beside me, and throughout the election and afterwards, my admiration and respect for this incredibly talented incredibly talented colleague just grew and grew. And I was so thrilled that when Elizabeth made the difficult decision to step down, that you were willing to step up and step forward. Folks, just a reminder to everyone to mute yourselves. I can help with that process in a moment, but that will help us with the technical side here and make things run smoothly. But without further ado, Annamie, over to you. And you'll have to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm really grateful for the introduction, and thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being with us. Thank you to all of you for being with us as well. And this is as Elizabeth said, we have the things that we want to talk about tonight, but we absolutely have to pay some attention to the things that are happening at this very moment. I would say for me, for those of you who don't know, my father passed away yesterday, and he passed away in circumstances that were avoidable. My very good friend Victoria Galea as well lost her uncle this week under very, very similar circumstances and also avoidable. And so, you know, there are moments where the reasons for me that I'm running and the reasons that we're doing this campaign become very, very clear. And this is one of those moments, just to think about some of the things this week. This week, I personally learned, I got a firsthand lesson about the failings in our healthcare system and in the way that we value the lives of our seniors. You know, our long-term care facilities in Ontario in particular, but across the country are a national shame. And it's a reflection of what we think about people in Canada towards the end of their lives. And my father was just caught up in exactly that. He was caught up in a system that cared more about the profits that they were going to make than they did about his life. And so we're grieving as a family, of course, but it's, you know, it was just one of the things this week. We also have to remember, as Elizabeth said, that the United States, the cities are on fire. And they're on fire because yet another Black man has died at the hands of the police. I lived in the States for a number of years, and I have cousins. I have quite an extensive family that lives in the United States. I have many Black male cousins living in the United States, and they live in constant fear for their lives, and rightly so. My husband didn't want to send our son, who was born in the United States and so is a Black American, as well as being a Black Canadian. He was unwilling to even entertain the idea of him studying in the United States for university because he just was not willing to take that risk with his life. At the same time, I was struck by the attention that was paid in our press here to those incidents in the States and still are being paid, while Indigenous peoples in this country and Black Canadians as well struggle to get any attention for the same incidents that happened to them. Indigenous peoples are incredibly overrepresented in our criminal justice system and in incarceration. They're a small fraction of the Canadian population, and in some parts of the country, they represent 3/4 of the people who are incarcerated. And so I was struck by that as well. I was also really struck by the fact that this week, our government announced that they were going to be delaying the National Plan of Action for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I made the point on a post just a few days ago that they were able to conceive of and deliver and launch a multi-$100 billion action plan for the oil sector, and they weren't able to deliver in a year an action plan for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so this tells us again about whose lives are valued, what we value, and what our priorities are. And so these were all things that happened this week. And so I'm just being hit by wave after wave of all of the reasons that these discussions that we have are so important. All of the reasons that having the Green Party is so important, and how much there is at stake, because we absolutely have to emerge from this period with a plan for a better future. You know, my sister was saying, and I believe my sister and my mother are both on this call, but my sister, who was just in tears yesterday, of course, was saying, you know, we have got to demand what we're worth. You know, this is not a society that gives humans what the value that they're worth, that attributes the value that they're worth. And so we are working towards real change, real tangible change that can make a difference for many, many people who need us and are counting on us to make that kind of a difference. And so in terms of tonight, you know, when we decided to do this series with Elizabeth, we wanted to talk about things that mattered. We wanted to give Elizabeth, in particular, who has been on the front lines for such a long time, an opportunity to have a conversation with me and with you about things that are really going to matter in terms of our recovery, in terms of thinking about what comes next. And one of the things that absolutely we need to give the attention that it deserves, because it's going to have such an impact on so many millions of people, is the future of our urban centers, the future of our cities. Over 80% of Canadians live in urban centers, and they were already struggling prior to the pandemic, but they are virtually on their knees now. Many of you will know that cities cannot run a deficit, and they are expected to balance their budget every year. I'm sorry about that. People are delivering flowers. I'll say it's the front door. And so, sorry. And so they were struggling before the pandemic, and now they are really at the brink of a crisis. How do you balance a budget during a pandemic, particularly when you're providing many of the services that people rely on the most in a pandemic? You simply can't. And so the cities need a plan. They needed a plan before, but they certainly need a plan now, and they need a plan that's going to provide them with enough certainty so that they can do proper urban planning. And they need a plan that's going to provide them with the revenue so that they can make the investments that anyone should when they're trying to take care of 80% of the people in Canada. And finally, I just wanted to touch very quickly on why we're here tonight as opposed to another night, and why we're having this event to raise funds. And this is something, for those of you who knew that my father passed away yesterday, perhaps I'm sure that you're wondering. We talked about it as a family, and Elizabeth really was very adamant that we should put it off, that we should delay. I practically dragged her to this event, and so I'm very grateful that she is here. But we did it tonight for some of the reasons are just really practical, and I think it's very important to be very frank with our members and supporters about what some of those reasons are. We are almost entirely driven by volunteers. With the exception of our campaign manager, we are just a volunteer organization. And so we are doing everything that is humanly possible for a group of volunteers to do in terms of running a national campaign. But there are some things that will require money if we are going to reach all of our members, if we are going to be able to run a campaign that Greens can be proud of, and if we are going to use this ourselves and other candidates to really as a catalyst for the next stage of our party's life. We should emerge from this leadership race with a new sense of vitality. And so we depend on donations, particularly from our members, given our limited ability to fundraise outside, literally outside these days, we rely on members for that support, because we're fortunate to live in a country where you really cannot buy an election, or at least it's very difficult. You need a lot of small donations from a lot of people that support you and believe in what you're doing in order to mount a campaign. And so we practically couldn't delay. I couldn't ask the team to come back and do this again. I could not have lived with myself, given Elizabeth's schedule, asking her to postpone and do this at another time, even though she begged me to do that. And so we're proceeding today. And in terms of these fundraising events in general, we have recognized in the Green Party that we have a systemic problem, and that systemic problem relates to diversity. We ran the least diverse slate of candidates in the last election, and less diverse, I want to really emphasize this, less diverse than the People's Party of Canada by a significant percentage. And so this is a systemic problem that simply is not going to go away on its own. We know that systemic problems require systemic solutions. And so I am really looking forward to the work of the new Federal Council on this theme. But in the meantime, we have a leadership race. And so the Green Party, instead of doing nothing in the face of the evidence, which is absolutely not our way, the Green Party decided to do something. And so Elizabeth has very generously given up quite a lot of her time, because essentially she will be covering all of the candidates in the race, and she is assisting us with our fundraising. She's the only person in the party that has the convening power to be able to do that. And so a lot falls on her shoulders, as it always has. And we're very grateful to her for that. But this is only a temporary solution. I really want to stress this. If the Green Party of Canada is going to make significant steps forward in the next election, particularly in Ontario, and I know you're not all from Ontario, but particularly in Ontario and particularly in urban centers, we have got to tackle this head on. We simply cannot ever imagine that we could be elected in any significant numbers if we do not reflect the demography of Canada. And these are just, again, this is evidence and these are facts, and so it's something that we have to take in. And so I'm going to do my very best to participate. I'm going to leave the fundraiser at the end to Tim and Elizabeth this time, just because I don't think I'm quite up for that, but I do really want to hear our discussion. Et je voulais juste aussi dire, je suis désolée que ce n'est pas un événement totalement bilingue, mais Elisabeth parle français, moi aussi je parle français. Nous avons des membres de notre équipe qui parlent français aussi. Je suis hâte le jour où nous aurions une traduction directe pour chaque événement. C'est très important, et c'est très important que nos frères et sœurs de la francophonie, qui se sentent vraiment tout présents, qui se sentent vraiment ici dans le centre de notre parti et pas toujours sur les marches. Alors, je voulais juste dire que s'il y a des personnes qui veulent qu'on fasse des remarques en anglais et français, s'il y a des questions en français, nous sommes tout à fait prêts à les prendre. Et avec ça, je passe la parole à Elisabeth et je le remercie beaucoup pour tous ses efforts. Elizabeth, thank you once more for stepping into the breach, and I'm going to pass it to you.
Elizabeth, you need to unmute yourself. Or maybe I will do it for you if I can get there. Let's just take a moment here, sorry.
Yes, thank you, Tim. You had as host, you had muted me. Imagine that someone could do that. No one has that power. I insist on being unmuted. Listen, I want to also express to Annamie how very difficult I know this is for her tonight. I relayed to Phil. I remember when my father died, I was just getting on with the work, and I didn't have a chance to take a pause. And I remember we had in Sydney. Some of you are locals. I see some friends on the call. We had a distinguished lecturer series that was nonpartisan in the community, and one of the, it was coming up very soon, was a distinguished lecturer series with the Right Honorable Joe Clark. And I said, well, I got to go back to Cape Breton to be with my family, and they should just go ahead with the event without me. And Joe Clark said, oh, no, 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 we'll come another time. And so I tried the same thing with Annamie, but the rules around this now have gotten a very, it's good to have clarity in the rules, but I am going to be doing events with other candidates. I'm not endorsing anyone, but as you can tell, I'm devoted to Annamie, and I know what a sacrifice this is to participate after such a significant personal loss. And I wanted to give her the space to not have to do it tonight. So it wasn't that I didn't want to be here. I wanted to protect her from having to be here, but I didn't think it made sense I'm so thrilled that 87 people are participating tonight, because a lot of you may not have met Annamie before, even though Zoom isn't really meeting. I hope you'll get a sense of what a terrific candidate she is. I look at this leadership race and truly, I imagine that every person in the race is going to join me in Parliament. One of you will be the leader, but the Parliamentary Caucus of Greens, we really are a very egalitarian group. We work together a lot, and I can't wait for Annamie Paul to be in Parliament. We need her. So I'm going to shift gears and just say a few things about the membership, the leadership race, without saying what candidate anyone might want to support. And when Annamie said you can't buy a race, it makes a difference how many members sign up. It really does. So please encourage friends of yours. You may assume they're Greens. You may see them at every potluck. I don't know about the rest of the country, but to Saanich Gulf Islands, we run on potluck suppers. You may see them at green drinks, but find out if they're a member. Sign them up. And if you happen to be a supporter of a candidate, tell them that. Tell them why. There are a lot of really strong Greens running. I know that right now Judy Green is close to having enough money for the first submission, and it's right down to the deadline. So I know this is crazy on a fundraiser for Annamie, but a shout out to Judy Green if you can help her get over the top, because the party has set some pretty stiff fundraising targets. To make this clear, this is why I wanted to help with fundraising for candidates that will help diversify the party and the image we give to the country. You have to raise $10,000 by, I think, is it June 2nd or June 4th? And then initially it was another 40 by the end of the summer. Now it's another 20. So in total, every candidate has to raise $30,000 before they can spend a penny on their own campaign. So the federal party rules, which I support because I'm part of council, were for per person, even in a pandemic, every candidate has to raise $30,000 by the end of August to be able to be on the ballot when members start voting. So we need more members. We need more members who will donate. And let me just clarify the Elections Canada donation rules before I start talking about the themes for tonight about the urban agenda. Elections Canada has created 3 opportunities, count them, 1, 2, 3 opportunities for you to donate to the Green Party of Canada in 2020. You can donate up to $1,625 to the federal party. You can donate up to $1,625 to your local EDA or any collection of EDAs totaling $1,625. And because it's in a leadership year, you can donate $1,625 to a leadership candidate or collection of leadership candidates. So think about that. It means that you can, does that mean contestants can't spend any money? Oh, you can spend the money, but you can't be put on the ballot till you've given $30,000 to the party. Answering Megan's question that I just saw pop up in the chat to be a bit distracting. Sorry about that, everyone. I tend to do that. If I see a question that I can answer right away, I'm going to grab it. So it means that if you're not affected by pandemic, if your economic security is pretty much unaffected in the pandemic, please give more to the Green Party of Canada, because we are affected by pandemic and donations have gone way down, partly because we didn't think it was appropriate to be sending out 1 million emails all the time saying give money to the Green Party right now, When I know members who are friends and former candidates, whoever, who have small businesses that are struggling and about to go under. One of my favorite friends in the Green Party, Lorraine Reckmans, had to leave shadow cabinet. As some of you will know, she's been Indigenous critic forever. Her husband runs a garage, and she says, I'm going to call it Grandma's Garage because I'm back to doing physical work all day long because we can't afford the staff, and we're trying to keep the garage open. She's back to, you know, and Lil McPherson, who runs 2 restaurants in Halifax, is struggling to see if she can keep them open. And Cynthia King, who runs a bicycle touring operation in PEI, wondering if she can keep her business open. So knowing so many Greens who are struggling, we didn't put out, the party staff has not been sending out the usual number of donate here. So I'm sorry for saying, that this is, oh, by the way, my bandwidth is low, Carolyn, because my bandwidth is good on the Government of Canada computer that I'm not allowed to use on Green Party business. Sorry about that. So here's the thing. We need to support the Green Party of Canada financially now, and we especially need to support Annamie Paul and her campaign and the campaigns across the country, knowing that this election, for the first time, this leadership race has serious financial targets that are required by the party, and that we're trying to fundraise in a pandemic. Holy smokes, Batman, what are we doing? But I am on council and I support our rules. So on to the other agenda, which is tonight, post-pandemic, and by the way, the Green Party will be coming out with a very inspiring, I hope, plan for what the world looks like post-pandemic. So these opportunities to chat with members are really, really helpful to me because we're still developing that vision of what the world is like post-pandemic. But I think it's one of those moments that that gets called a hinge of history. A moment of big shifts. So unlike the 2008 financial crisis with Stephen Harper and John Baird and the shovel-ready projects to get the economy going again, those worked, but they weren't transformative, right? They just said, let's boost our pollution back up to where it was before. And we can go in one of 2 directions, but we have the opportunity post-pandemic for transformative change so that we never again see our seniors warehoused in for-profit conditions where every penny you can save by paying staff not enough and not having a decent kitchen in the facility for really healthy, nutritious food to be served. All of that penny saving in how we treat our seniors is delivering profits to really large corporations that have been able to run seniors housing outside of the Canada Health Act. So we are saying as Greens, senior care, long-term care has to be in the Canada Health Act so that we have national standards and no one can go below them. And we should not allow this to be for profit any more than we allow our hospitals to be for profit. We need to embrace universal single payer principles of our Canada Health Act and apply them to care of our seniors. And we need to relook at our cities. The urban agenda right now is, Annamie, you couldn't have said it better. The cities are on their knees. Without the money that used to come through the fare box in every TTC or SkyTrain in Vancouver, the cities are I was talking to Lisa Helps, the mayor of Victoria, the other day. She said, we're getting close to where we're going to have to lay off city workers because we don't have any money coming in. And I am, just to give you guys a sense of this, I'm in regular contact with Bill Morneau, Minister of Finance. I'm in regular contact with Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland and with Prime Minister and with all the ministers. It's the pandemic has kind of flattened the hierarchy and gotten rid of a lot of partisanship. So I'm talking to everybody. But with Bill Morneau, this is the one issue where when I go to him and say, we have got to rescue our cities and local governments, it's the one place of complete pushback. It's the one, no. because cities and local governments are creatures of the provinces under the Constitution, and we are not. I mean, for heaven's sake! So it's
jump in on that one,
Elizabeth.
Jump in. For those of you who don't know, I ran against Bill Morneau in Toronto Centre in the last election. Bill Morneau is the Minister of Finance, in case anyone doesn't know. The riding that he represents is the smallest riding in Canada. It also has some of the most significant pockets of low-income people in the country. It is also one of the top 10 least affordable ridings in the country. And it also is the center of the opioid crisis in the country. And it has 5 of the 7 safe injection sites in the city. And so those are the people that he represents, right? Those are the people that he represents. And so when I hear you saying that he's pushing back about this, when he knows that the people who would be helped the most and first are the people who elected him to represent them, it's incredibly frustrating for me. Incredibly frustrating. And I talked about that with him during our debates, you know, just telling him his first responsibility are to the people who sent him there in the first place. And so that's very disappointing. Back to you.
Well, it's a complicated dynamic. And what I'll say is the more I dig into it, and this is discouraging when I just spoke to, and by the way, Carolyn, I'm worried about when you said bandwidth is low. I'm trying to talk more slowly and hope everybody can hear me okay. But when you really push, because we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars right now because we need to, and Canada isn't doing anything much different than most nations. Some are spending a bit more than us, some are spending a bit less than us. Now is not the time to have, which I already hear from my constituents, how are we going to pay for this? It's going to be a really big debt. We need to keep spending more, and the federal government, the national government, has ways of spending money because we're sovereign. And basically the Bank of Canada, and this isn't a discussion we've had really for a long time. What about monetary policy? What about going to the Bank of Canada instead of commercial banks? This is what we're really doing to keep the country afloat. The governor of the Bank of Canada, he hasn't been printing new money exactly, but he has been guaranteeing that billions of dollars enter the economy on a weekly basis every week, buying up government bonds, federal government bonds, provincial government bonds, to get liquidity, to get money flowing into the economy. It's really interesting. But why the pushback on cities? I hate to say it, Annamie. It's making me quite sick to say it, but I've heard this from Liberal backbenchers who share the same concern with me of why aren't we seeing rescue packages for the cities? To give money to the cities, the federal government will have to funnel it through the provinces. The provinces will run for re-election on what they did. They won't say full credit to, you know, we got this money from the feds and then we gave it to you, right? So it speaks of a very worrying degree of partisan stupidity, really, to have money for where 80% of Canadians live in local governments. If we end up allowing our cities to teeter towards bankruptcy, and if we see mayor after mayor and council after council have to make the decision that they're laying off city workers, bear in mind, cities don't have access to the wage subsidy, and any city worker who's laid off, of course, has access to the CERB. But yeah, I just see Ann Lavender's question. You can give to the Green Party 3 times this year, 3 times. You can give federally to the Green Party of Canada, 1625, and you can give 1625 to your EDA or collection of EDAs. And you can give 1625 to Annamie Paul or a combination of Annamie and any other leadership candidates that you'd like to support. So that's 3 times 1625 is your legal maximum this year. Okay, so I'm tearing my hair out over it, honestly, because I've been so, honestly, the Green Caucus feels like we've been so successful in this period of pandemic and I'm so glad to share this with you as Greens, on issue after issue, we've been making a really big difference. I think it's entirely due to us that that sounds a little bit bold, but definitely we were the ones who said, if you're going to put money into oil sand, into helping fossil fuels, give it to the workers and put it into remediating orphaned wells. And that's what they did. And we provided briefing notes and background documents, and and I wouldn't call a press conference and say this, or we'd never influence them again. They might have come to this on their own, which is why I can't say we take the credit for this. It was a decision made by the Liberal cabinet, and I think it was the right one. But we've been making, just so you know, as Green members who are on this call and care enough about the party to try to get to know Annamie Paul and be here to help her campaign, we're making a difference in Parliament. We'd make a bigger difference if there was more of us, if there were more of us. But we are making that difference because we operate on an evidence-based fashion, and we operate in a nonpartisan fashion. And on a nonpartisan basis, I'm trying to get Bill Morneau to change his mind and get the rescue package to our local governments because they are struggling.
Great.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. And I said during the election, I reminded him, and I reminded the people choosing who they wanted to represent them that one, it is much more impactful for a riding like ours to have someone that is going to be working tirelessly the way that our Green Caucus does, even if you're not in government. It's no good to have the Minister of Finance if the Minister of Finance is saying that he's not going to be sending any money toward you. And then two, there is just one citizen, let's say. It's not a different one. We don't split ourselves into three people depending on which level of government it is. The responsibility of the various levels of government is absolutely to work together to the maximum, oh my gosh, my words are failing me today, to the maximum amount possible to make sure that they are getting people in Canada what they need, the services they need, the help that they need. And these kind of intergovernmental disputes, these things, Canadians, I believe that especially after the pandemic, we will have just far less patience for it than we did before. We're going to demand far more intergovernmental cooperation, and clearly the cities just need a new deal. Maybe either you or Tim can mention, talk a little bit about the fact that we say this, and at times people say, well, now we're getting into constitutional things. Now you're talking about new constitutional arrangements. How can this practically be done? Yeah. Perhaps we can talk about that, and maybe we can talk about the Council of Canadian Governments that we had mentioned in our 2019, proposed in our 2019 platform.
Well, I'd love to talk about that because what we came up with it in our 2015 platform, and we were developing that platform through Shadow Cabinet, and came to discover something called the Council of Australian Governments. And Australia is quite like us in that they are a federated state. The individual state governments have a lot of clout. And the municipal local governments are a creature of the states. And Australia created the Council of Australian Governments without having to change their constitution by creating a table at which the people, the decision makers come and arrive at shared goals. Now that Council of Australian Governments has several different tables. So there's the national one where the Prime Minister and the premiers of the individual states sit with local government representatives. Not every city, not every local government, but representative balancing of the big city mayors and local and rural sitting at the same table on national policy. And then they have multiple subtables where looking at transportation policy, looking at housing policy, and so on. the refinement that we made in, as you wouldn't be surprised, the Green Party of Canada for a Council of Canadian Governments was to divide that circle, that table, in quadrants. One of my favorite Canadian mayors is Don Iveson from Edmonton. And when I described it to him, he said, it's a medicine wheel. It's an Indigenous medicine wheel. You've got the four. So our quadrants are federal, provincial, territorial, local governments, and Indigenous governments. So First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. That approach would allow us to have policy coherence. So as Annamie says, there's this one citizen who isn't all that well served all that often by a provincial government that's in a tug of war with the feds, doesn't get along, and it completely ignores the reality that we're on Indigenous land and Indigenous people have sovereignty, and we need to deal nation to nation. If your Council of Canadian Governments actually work, you don't need to change the Constitution to make it work. That was one of Bill Morneau's more annoying lines to me, Annamie, in one of our meetings. He said, well, COVID-19 didn't repeal the British North America Act. Well, I'll suppress the low grrrs that I was feeling at that moment. But anyway, yeah. So the Council of Canadian Governments, you do not need to open the Constitution to create it. You just need to say, we're refining our decision-making processes in Canada because we recognize that local governments need a seat at the table. I mean, and Tim, of course, is shadow cabinet critic on local government, so I'm sure you're dying to jump in here to make sure I don't muck up our policy, Tim, but Tim Grant has been playing a very helpful role in all the, but we need local governments to have a seat at the table. Most of the stuff that affects Canadians' lives is the stuff our local government does for us. It's running the buses and the subways and the picking up the recycling and running the water system and you name it. Well, holy mackerel, if they don't have money, I mean, often as a kind of a joke, I say, how would we know if the federal government went out on strike? No one asked for our taxes, but would you know when your local government's out on strike because the streets start filling up with trash and the buses aren't running. So local governments really, really need to have a seat at the table, and we need to get past the strictures of the assumptions of 1867 when we were primarily, obviously, 80% of Canadians in 1867 lived in rural areas. And the Constitution reflects that reality. It doesn't reflect the 21st century reality that we are an urban people. We need a new vision for our urban reality post-COVID, which I think is kind of, it's already starting with people saying, cities and mayors all around the world saying, we're reopening, but we don't want to reopen to cars. Our first priority is to reopen to people and bicycles, and we have to let the sidewalk cafes have more physical spacing, so they're going to start taking over the streets, and we're going to make sure our parks are more accessible and that people are outdoors, but we still want to make sure people aren't crowded.
Elizabeth, we are losing you a little bit, and I'm going to actually, I'm the last person who likes to cut you off, and especially on a topic
That's okay, cut me off.
Near and dear to my heart. But we are also, part of this session was also to ask you to use your considerable skills to lead us in and introduce what many may not be familiar with, which is called a Dutch auction. It's a particular style of fundraiser. Can you explain?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm really taking advantage today, but I apologize. The last thing, it's the only thing, is the last thing. I just wanted to say, Tim, before we head into that, you know, our arrangements in 1867, as I'm sure you know, and you know, Tim, and you know, Elizabeth, they were always intended to be temporary arrangements until we decided what we wanted to do. And so they were never meant to be cast in stone. It is a real sign of immaturity that we have not revisited these things. You know, we have got to, you know, seize our own destiny, take it into our hands and do things that are going to work for us here in this moment. And so we can't, you know, anyone who relies on that should read the document, and they will see that it was never supposed to be, you know, a lasso around us for the rest of our lives. So that's it. Sorry, Tim.
Great. No, that's a good introduction.
Oh, yeah,
Elizabeth.
and I wanted to, if you'll forgive me before I agree with you about that, Annamie, and let me just, for fun, because this weekend is also the annual general meeting of Fair Vote Canada, and I don't know how many of you were trying to follow them on Zoom this morning, where Paul Manley was a speaker. But that was another thing in the first Constitution that said, our Constitution in 1867 said, Canadians can use the same system we're using now in England until you get around to picking your own system, right? This wasn't supposed to be forever that we're wearing Queen Victoria's hand-me-downs. We're tripping over them. They don't fit us at all, like, you know? So anyway, that we were supposed to pick our own voting system too, but we're still living with what we got in 1867 for no reason. And I also wanted, Megan, forgive me, I'm never sure Megan or Megan Ardash, who's doing such great work. I just want to say, on the climate emergency, her question was, which is the most important order of government, level of government to work in? It's all of them, really? It's all of them. But if we ignore the critical role of the federal government, we will not survive the climate emergency. We absolutely have to keep pressure up on the federal government to have new climate targets this year, whether we're meeting at COP26 or not, and we are not. They just moved COP26 to a full year's delay to November 2021, but 2020 is still the deadline for the climate target being, it should be doubled for Canada to pull our